I'm blessed. Marquis de Lafayette was a French officer who provided invaluable assistance to one George Washington during the American Revolution, when the American Army was struggling badly. When the war was over, Lafayette returned to France and resumed his life as a farmer of many estates. In 1783, there was essentially a famine in France. The harvest was horrible, and many of the French suffered as a result. However, in a coincidence of fate, Lafayette's farms were unaffected by the devastating crop failures. One of his servants took it upon himself to offer what seemed to him to be good advice. The farmhand said to Lafayette, "The bad harvest has raised the price of wheat. This is the time to sell." After thinking about all the hungry people in the surrounding towns, Lafayette said, "No, this is the time to give." In a similar situation, Nehemiah finds himself in the text today. Having just righted the wrongs between family members who were essentially oppressing their own kin by making them sell their children into slavery just in order to buy something to eat during their time of famine. Like Lafayette, Nehemiah doesn't take advantage of his people. But because Nehemiah is blessed, Nehemiah instead gives more generously. And here Nehemiah teaches us a valuable lesson about the blessings of God in our lives. You see, Nehemiah teaches us that God's blessings are not just for our own personal benefit, but Nehemiah teaches us that God's blessings are for our collective benefit. Simply put, perhaps you've heard it this way before: God blesses us to bless others. Human nature and our tendency is to hoard and to save and to take and to build up. But you see, God doesn't measure our lives based on how much we have. God measures our lives based on how much we give. You see, God is not glorified by our gain or our greed. But God is glorified in our generosity and in our giving. And even in those moments where it seems like giving is the last thing we should or want to do, giving is still the best antidote for our need. Because as the old song says, you really can't beat God's giving, no matter how hard you try. You see, what's small in your hands becomes magnified and multiplied in the Master's hands. Just ask the widow Zarephath, whose meal and oil never ran dry. Just ask the little boy in all four of the Gospels with 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. If you don't know any Bible this Sunday morning, just look at Big Mama. How she fed all those children with just 1 chicken and a pot of greens. So it's that through remembering God's purpose, relying on God's power, and remaining on God's providence, we can shift our perspective on our own purpose. We can shift our perspective on our own power, and we can shift our perspective on our own possessions to become the generous person our generous provider desires us to be. And so then the question that we have to wrestle and answer with this morning is then, how then do I, like Nehemiah, shift my focus on all of these things? Well, church family, if the text be true, and if the text have cues and clues, and I believe that it does, the first thing you and I must do if we are to shift our focus to become the generous person God wants us to be is at base, we must first have a conviction about God's majesty. After Nehemiah cleans up last week's family matters, where the rich folk in the land had no problem taking from the poor folk of the land, it just so happened to be their family members, Nehemiah takes a look at his own life. Takes a look at how his life is intertwined with others. You see, what has been implied up until this point in the book is made explicit in these verses. that Nehemiah is the governor of Jerusalem. But listen to what I just said. Nehemiah is the governor. He's not the king. Jerusalem and Israel is no longer an independent nation. And while Nehemiah is a Jew, and while the people who have returned to live and to work on the wall are Jews too, Jerusalem was still ultimately under control of Nehemiah's boss, who was, remember him, the king of Persia. Though Nehemiah was able to finally get the job done that other governors were not able to get done, the job of rebuilding the wall and restoring their witness, Nehemiah was able to do this because Nehemiah had at base a conviction about God's majesty. Nehemiah was convicted that though he was the governor, though he may have been legally entitled to have what had historically been the governor's share that he describes in verse 15 as extra food and wine and 40 shekels of silver a day from the people, you see, Nehemiah doesn't take it. Nehemiah was convicted that though this extra share of food and wine and silver was within his legal right as the governor, for him to take it would be ethically wrong. Nehemiah realized that if he took it, that it would be placing another heavy burden on his people. In addition to the heavy burden that had already been imposed upon them by their own family in just the verses before this, and not to mention the heavy burden of rebuilding the wall. Nehemiah was convicted to not do this, to not take what was historically and legally and traditionally the governor's share because of what he said in that last part of verse 15. Nehemiah said, "But I did not do so because of the fear of God." Isn't it interesting here that Nehemiah spends 2 long verses talking about the time he spent in the king's administration, how long it had been, 12 years to be exact. Isn't it interesting how Nehemiah spends 2 verses talking about the time before him and what the former governors did, and then concludes this history lesson by saying, "But I didn't do that because I feared God." Isn't it amazing how one leader who actually has a fear, a respect, a reverence, a conviction about God, how this one leader can literally determine the success and trajectory of an entire people? Sounds like a much needed message for some of our leaders involved in a little trial that started in D.C. this past week. Churchman, it's amazing what a conviction about God's majesty will do for you and for everybody else connected to you. You see, when you are convicted about God's majesty, when you truly know God for yourself, when you know that God is holy, when you know that only God is all merciful, you know that only God is all wise, when you know that only God is all gracious, when you know that only God is all kind, when you know that only God is all loving, when you know that only God is all powerful, you don't take others and you sure don't take yourself too seriously. Because guess what? None of us are that good. I don't care if you're the king of Persia. I don't care if you're the governor of Jerusalem. I don't care if you're the queen of England. And I sure don't care if you're the president of the United States. Just because you sit in a seat of power, that does not give you all power. That only belongs to God. I don't care if you have a good job. I don't care if you worked your way up from the bottom. I don't care if you have an Ivy League degree. I don't care that you're now a manager or a vice president or the CEO and got some letters behind your name. Your name is still whatever your mama gave you. And it's still not higher than the name that is above every name. In order to be the generous people that God desires us to be, we have to start with a conviction about God's majesty. See, at the end of the day, when the rubber meets the road, when the stuff hits the fan, when you're high and mighty and stepping in high cotton or waiting in the trenches of life, you have to answer this question at all times and always: who is God to you? Amen. See, you know who your boss is, and on your best day, you may even know who you are. But on your worst day, who is God to you? Who do you say that God is? We know our favorite celebrities. We know our favorite singers. We know our favorite athletes. We follow their careers, their moves. We follow what they do on social media. We know their stats, what they like, what they don't like, what beauty products they use, what designers they wear, who they endorse, but we don't really know them. Let me flip it on you real quick at the end of this first point. Can you say the same about your God? How well do you know him? I'm talking about how well do you know him, even beyond the pages of this Bible. Has God become real in your soul? I know that's old school preaching for some people. I know that offends and assaults some of our modern proclivities. I know that upsets some folk who believe that's an outdated way of thinking and preaching. But let me free you, my brother and my sister. You will never get where you want to go until God becomes real to you. Yes, you may climb the heights of the social ladder. You will not have gotten off the ground, and what really matters, you will have gained the world and have lost your soul. Till God becomes real to you, you'll make it to the top to only realize that it ain't the top. That it's lonely there, and while you may have some people under you, God is still over you. See, church family, everything you do, everything you say, everything you are, I would submit, is a theological statement. It declares who you believe God to be, and what does your life, what does your words, what does your action, what does your habits, what does your relationships, what does the sum total of your life, what does all of that have to say about your Lord? Who is God to you? That's the reason why some of us can't find it in our hearts to be generous. God is not all to us. God is something else. Some of us have made a decision along the way, be it conscious or unconscious, that money is better than the master. Clothes are better than the creator. That status is better than the savior. That wealth is better than the way maker. We've been convicted by material goods and not convicted by the majesty of God. That's why the songwriter said some folks would rather have houses and land. Some folks choose silver and gold. These things they treasure and forget about their soul. But I wish I had a witness in the sanctuary who would say that I've decided to make Jesus my choice. Because how many know when the road is rough and the going gets tough and the hills hard to climb, all of that stuff will pass away. And only God will stand there in the end. Like the old preachers told us before we went to seminary, you got to get your Jesus right. You and I are going to shift our focus to become the generous person God wants us to be. We've got to take that conviction about God's majesty and then produce, secondly, a connection to the greater mission. Because Nehemiah feared God and led him to do what he did in verse 16 and verse 17. See there, Nehemiah devoted himself to work on this wall. And out of his own pocket and at his own table, Nehemiah fed 150 people. Watch this, every day. And he didn't just feed them peanut butter and jelly sandwiches either. Look at verse 18. Just for one day, he prepared 1 ox, 6 sheep, and an unnumbered amount of fowls. That's chicken, y'all. Amen. And even look at this. Every 10 days, Nehemiah prepared skins of wine in abundance. And if we take a literal translation of the text from the original Hebrew, that would be over 80 gallons of wine. Let the church say amen. See, a couple weeks ago, I was in Houston celebrating Pastor Cosby's anniversary, and You all know how I enjoy eating at and trying new restaurants. There's a restaurant there that has gained so much popularity, everybody raves about it. I constantly see it on social media. It's a restaurant named the Turkey Leg Hut. It all started out as a side hustle in 2016 in the parking lot of the Houston Rodeo. And now, just 3 short years later, with no culinary background, Nakia and Lynn Price have exploded on the foodie scene with buildings and trucks and lines literally wrapped around the block day and night. So y'all know that I had to go check out Turkey Leg Hut.
All right.
So after I waited in line for an hour, seated at a table that was set up outside in the midst of the hustle and bustle. The waitress, of course, then came over to the table. Instead of trying to rush me out as I would expect, or being worn out from the constant flow of customers, or simply just being exhausted from that Houston heat, the waitress had the most cheerful attitude of every waitress I've ever served. She danced along to the music with us. She cracked jokes with us. She told us what to get off the menu and how much to get. She was attentive. She made sure we got everything we needed, and she did it all with a smile and a laugh. You see, while her job as a waitress was just to make sure I got my turkey leg, keep the long line, the overflowing orders moving, she made our experience greater than just fulfilling the basic duties of her job. She viewed her job as connected to a larger mission or work she believed she was called to do that was bigger than just waiting tables. She said something at the beginning of our dining experience. She said, "I'm not your waitress." She said, "I'm here to serve y'all and to make sure you have a good time." And like that sister at the Turkey Leg Hut, and like Nehemiah in our text, if we're going to be generous, we have to adopt that same kind of attitude. Yes, we've got to be competent workers. Yes, we've got to get the job done, but the job is never just the job. Yes, the wall needed brick and mortar, but if it was going to get done, it was going to take more than brick and mortar. It was also going to take buy-in and motivation. It's going to take blessings and morale. It was going to take backbone and mission. Sometimes pursuing the greater mission that God has for you requires you going above and beyond the job description. Sometimes pursuing and connecting with the greater mission requires you going above and beyond the basic requirements. This is where it's about to get real quiet in the sermon, but that's okay. I said amen in the house before I got here. That's why when people ask me about tithing and how and if they're expected to give a whole 10%, and they tell me how it doesn't make sense, so forth and so on, I say that it's really not a percent issue. It's a heart issue. You see, 10% is the law, which just means that that's baseline. That's just a basic requirement. That's a duty. That's an obligation we are to meet. That's what you're supposed to do. But being generous the way God wants us to be is never about meeting a 10% obligation. It's about our mission as the people of God meeting an opportunity. And when that reality gets down in your soul, it will go beyond the basic requirements. It will make you generous beyond the baseline. You see, Nehemiah was the governor. It was not his job to feed the people. It was his job to make sure that the wall got rebuilt. But remember, Nehemiah's job was not just simply about rebuilding a wall. Nehemiah's work was really about restoring their witness. The Baptist preacher, Dr. George W. Truett, accepted an invitation from a church to preach the dedication sermon for their new church building. He arrived at the church about 10 minutes before the service was scheduled to start and was told by the church leaders that he needed to raise $6,500 by the next day in order to finish paying for the building. Church officers told him that they were depending on him to raise that money. They always do us Baptist preachers wrong. Dr. Truitt preached the sermon. Then at the end he said, "These men bid me to tell you that you must give $6,500 in cash, which is due tomorrow. Will you provide it?" After Dr. Truitt's appeal began the slowest, most reluctant, most shameful offering anybody had ever witnessed. After 30 minutes passed, y'all know how we used to do the lines and the counters. They had just $3,000, not even half of what they needed. Dr. Truitt said, "What do you expect of me? I am your guest. I don't have the other $3,500. This ain't my church, this y'all's church. What do you expect from me?" Then a woman stood up and called to her husband, who was at the front of the church collecting the offering. She spoke to her husband, and the congregation overheard. She said, "Charlie, I wonder if you would be willing for us to give our little cottage that we just paid the mortgage on. We were offered $3,500 in cash for it yesterday. We were told we could get it at the bank any time within the next 10 days. She said, "Charlie, I wonder if you would be willing for us to give our little house to Christ so that his house can be free." She said, "When we remember, Charlie, that Christ gave his life for us, I wonder if we ought not give our little house to him." Charlie replied to his wife, "Jenny, dear, I was thinking the same thing. We'll give the $3,500. Silence fell over the congregation. Then grown men were heard weeping. And in just a few moments, the remaining $3,500 was given by the rest of the congregation, who had either refused or had given grudgingly. And get this, a whole lot of visitors had come for that special service. Before Dr. Truitt opened the doors of the church, folks came running down every aisle to give their life to Christ. That's what our generosity does. It's not about the job. It's not about the act. It's not about the duty. It's about connecting us to the greater mission. You see, church family, generosity is the bridge between where we have been and where God is calling us to go. Being generous allows God to be even more generous with us, because it shows God that we have an understanding of who He is, who He has called us to be, and what He has called us to do. And that our generosity qualifies us for promotion, because generosity shows God that God can trust us with His greater mission as we journey along the way. That gets me to my third and final point, that if you and I are going to shift our focus to become the generous person God wants us to be, we've got to have a conviction about God's majesty. We've got to have a connection to the greater mission. And finally, we've got to have a confidence in God's good measure. It's interesting here that Nehemiah closes this section recounting his generosity with a short prayer in verse 19. Nehemiah calls out to the Lord. He says, "Remember for my good, oh my God, all that I've done for this people." And upon first glance, this verse, this prayer, can seem a little off-putting. But if you sit with it, it's not the self-righteous boast it can come off as at the first glance. And if you keep on sitting with it, it's not even a quid pro quo. It's not a pay-to-play move. It's not a if I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of deal. But it really is confidence. Though Nehemiah was giving out of his own pocket so generously every day for 12 years, Nehemiah understood that no matter the measure of his generosity, it was still no match for the good measure of God's generosity. And that's all I've come to say to you today. That is, God has been gracious to each and every one of us. Some of you looking at me like, how can you know that? You don't know what's in my bank account. You don't know what bills I had to pay. You don't know what I've been through. That might be true. But I'm going to give you 5 reasons how I know God has been generous to you. I'm going to tell you these 5 reasons. These 5 reasons are not unique to my own intellectual property. These are 5 reasons my pastor back home used to say, and then I'm going to tell you these, and I'm going to get out your way. But these are the 5 reasons how I know God has been generous to you. You ready for them? Number 1, He woke you up this morning, started you on your way. Number 2, He woke you up this morning and started you on your way. Reason number 3, He woke you up this morning, started you on your way. Reason number 4, He woke you up this morning, started you on your way. Number 5, He woke you up this morning and started you on your way. So just like Mama taught us, anytime somebody has been generous to you, you ought to say thank you. So you know that the Lord has been generous to you. You ought to stand on your feet and you ought to lift up your hands and you ought to throw your head back and say thank you. And say